Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Left Bench Podcast, the show where we can't play sports, so we talk about them instead. I hope you all are having a fantastic day this Good Friday. I hope you all are excited about Easter, getting ready to spend that time with your family, and really enjoy remembering what Christ did for us. Just a quick announcement before we really dive into today's news. We've been doing these podcast episodes every other day, and so the next episode after today would be slated for Sunday. However, since it is Easter, I'm going to be taking that day off, but we'll start back up again on Tuesday, and that'll be the next episode of the podcast, and hopefully, if all goes well technically, that'll be the first episode of the Left Bench Podcast to include full video as well as audio. So if you guys are excited for that, make sure to go ahead and drop a like, leave a comment on how I can really improve these episodes. I've been noticing that there was kind of a decline from the first episode to the second episode, so if there's anything that I can really do to kind of spice things up or make it more enjoyable, please let me know, because I'd really be interested in your feedback. If you guys don't want to comment here, go ahead and make sure to follow me at the Left Bench Pod on Instagram, and go ahead and leave some comments there, or even just DM me about some suggestions that you may have if you don't really want it to be a public thing. So for today's episode, what we're going to do is kind of focus on football. We're going to do something a little bit different. First, we're going to talk about a trade that happened just yesterday. And then after that, we're going to move into the top 5 most improved teams from free agency and the top 5 least improved teams after free agency. And we'll look at those to kind of see how the playoffs next year are going to shape up and just get some opinions moving forward about what the NFL is going to look like. So let's go ahead and dive into the trade that happened yesterday. If you're up to date with the news, you know that this trade was between the Houston Texans as well as the Los Angeles Rams. Now, both of these teams kind of underperformed last year compared to expectations. The Texans obviously doing way better than the Rams. They actually made the playoffs and they got a little bit further in the playoffs, but they had that awful decision to do a fake punt in that game against the Chiefs, which ultimately led to their demise after being up by 24, still ending up losing the game to Kansas City, who went on to win the Super Bowl. But both of these teams had high expectations for next year. And before free agency, both of these teams looked like potential contenders. But if you've been paying attention, you know that the Texans made a really, really odd decision to trade away DeAndre Hopkins to the Arizona Cardinals for washed-up running back David Johnson. And so what that means is that the Texans have been in a market for a new receiver. Why exactly? Well, after losing DeAndre Hopkins, that makes their number one receiver Will Fuller. And while Will Fuller is great, he's really good at getting open, he's really good in coverage, he is not at all a number one receiver. Not even close. And their number 2 receiver was Kenny Stills, who they got halfway through the season from the Dolphins. And generally, if a player's not good enough for the Dolphins, he's not really good enough for any other team either. Kenny Stills is not a great player in the league. He's a mediocre wide receiver at best. And also in free agency, the Texans decided to pick up Randall Cobb from the Dallas Cowboys and sign him to a 3-year deal. Now, Randall Cobb had a great season last year with the Cowboys, posting over 800 yards, but a 3-year deal is a little bit risky for someone this old and for someone who's had kind of here-there production. He was good for a while in the Packers, and then he wasn't so great, and then he went to the Cowboys and he was good, so there's no telling how good he's going to be. So this trade that happened between the Texans and the Rams is in that same area. It's about a wide receiver. And that wide receiver is Brandin Cooks. The Rams traded Brandin Cooks and a 4th-round pick to the Texans for a 2nd-round pick, the 57th overall in the NFL draft. Now this is funny to me because it reminds me of a time in my life. See, I went on this Disney cruise a couple of years back. And while I was there, the best part by far was the banana ice cream. It was fantastic. They had this dispenser in the middle of the boat. You could walk to it pretty much at all times during the day, and you had unlimited banana ice cream. And now I'm a person who doesn't really like bananas, but I love banana-flavored things for some reason, and this ice cream tasted like banana Laffy Taffy. It was amazing. It was the best thing I ever had. And the time that I did have it was great. It was perfect. And then I had to leave. And I had to leave the banana ice cream behind. And when I came home after the cruise, I was looking everywhere for something to satisfy my craving for banana ice cream. I looked up and down and went to Disneyland. I asked cast members. I went to different ice cream shops looking for it. And there were a couple places who had banana ice cream, but it was nowhere near as good. The banana ice cream was okay. It wasn't really great, but it was serviceable. You see, that is the situation the Texans are in. They had some delicious banana ice cream in DeAndre Hopkins. Filled every single one of their needs. He was arguably a number 1 or number 2 receiver in the entirety of the NFL. And they gave him up. They didn't have to give him up. They chose to give up DeAndre Hopkins. Bill O'Brien made the decision to get rid of their number one wide receiver, the number one receiver in the NFL. And so ever since then, they've been scrambling for receivers, and that's exactly what this trade is. Brandin Cooks from the Rams to the Texans is just yet another attempt for the Texans to pick up a replacement for DeAndre Hopkins. But here's the problem, is that instead of looking for that fantastic banana ice cream again, something to really quench their hunger, they decided to get a bunch of bowls of mediocre ice cream. And it's not doing them justice. It doesn't at all fill their needs. So let's look a little bit deeper into this trade. In 2018, Brandin Cooks had a pretty great season. He had 80 receptions for 1,204 yards and 5 touchdowns. And at that time, he was considered a premier receiver in the NFL. He's bounced around a lot from the Patriots to the Rams, now going to the Texans. And people had high expectations for him last season. Me personally being a fantasy guy, when I was looking at receivers, he was one of the top receivers I looked at. I thought he was going to have a pretty good year, and he was going to be pretty underrated, and maybe I could catch him in one of the later rounds. Now, when you look at that Rams roster, they had 3 great receivers in Brandin Cooks and Robert Woods. And now, at the end of last season, you look back and you think, what happened? How did the Rams not do better with that great of a receiving core? Well, it wasn't really as great as we thought. Brandin Cooks last year had 42 receptions for 583 yards and 2 touchdowns. He had half the amount of receptions, less than half the amount of yards, and less than half the amount of touchdowns. Brandin Cooks completely declined last season. He is the definition of a slot receiver. He is a third option at best. And when you look at the Texans now, with Kenny Stills, Randall Cobb, Will Fuller, and Brandin Cooks, he's probably a fourth option on that team, maybe third above Kenny Stills. He is not going to be a star on the Texans. So when I look at this trade from the Texans' perspective, I'd probably give it a C-. There are better receivers they could have picked up. If anything, they should have got speedy wideout Robbie Anderson. But they chose to get Brandin Cooks. I don't know how I feel about it. Honestly, not impressed. And when you look at the rest of their team, this strategy isn't a bad one of getting a lot of good receivers, a lot of mediocre receivers to kind of fill the gap. But the problem with the Texans is that they need more time to be able to throw the ball. And when I say they, I mean Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson last year was absolutely torn apart. He had 55 sacks. He took 55 sacks last season. That's number 1 in the NFL. He took the most sacks out of any other quarterback in the league. And that was even after Laramie Tunsil got there from the Dolphins. The Texans' O-line is abysmal. It's terrible. And so when you put a quarterback who's generally pretty good at escaping sacks behind that O-line, and they still get 55 sacks, you know there's an issue. So the problem they're going to face is that they can't really clear any space for the passing game whatsoever. Because in order to do that, you need a great running back. Fantastic example of this. Dallas Cowboys. Why were they able to get so many passing yards? Because people were afraid of Ezekiel Elliott. They have to stack the box because they're worried about him running through and tearing apart the defense. Tennessee Titans, another perfect example of that. They were scared of Derrick Henry. No one is scared of David Johnson. He is an old, washed-up running back. And the funny thing is, his specialty as a running back was never even just running the ball up the middle. It wasn't good, hard runs. It was catching the ball in the backfield. And they already have Duke Johnson for that. So they really don't have a running game that is going to inspire fear in the hearts of their enemies. So the passing game isn't going to open up, meaning that defenses are able to rush maybe 3 or 4 guys on that O-line and still get sacks and also drop people back in coverage. And it's going to take way more time for those guys to get open because the receivers that the Texans have are mediocre at best. They're not great off the line. They're not great route runners. They're not great at catching in traffic. Teams are easily going to be able to take advantage of the Texans and take advantage of the receiving core that they have and the fact that they have no running back. This trade is going to bite the Texans in the butt because they shouldn't have traded DeAndre Hopkins in the first place. And at this point, when it comes to receiver trades, they're 0 for 2. So let's switch gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about free agency, both last week and this week. But what has been the aftermath of free agency? Well, what I want to do is give you 5 teams who have really improved this offseason and 5 teams who really haven't. So we'll go ahead and get into the order of this. At the 5th most improved team, we have the Dallas Cowboys. Now, hear me out on this one. A lot of people have been condemning the Dallas Cowboys offseason by saying that they lost too many key pieces and they're basically going to collapse next season. You see, the Cowboys had one goal going into this offseason. It was to keep the players that they had, or at least keep the major players. And those two players being Amari Cooper and Dak Prescott. So we knew that one of them was going to have to get franchise tagged because of how much we paid Zeke last year. Meaning that when the Dallas Cowboys paid both Amari Cooper as well as franchise tag Dak Prescott, that was what they needed to do right there. We lost a couple of pieces. We lost Randall Cobb. We lost Jeff Heath. But really in free agency, we covered everything that we needed to cover. We re-signed Blake Jarwin to a 3-year deal. And honestly, Blake Jarwin played better last year than Jason Witten did. And so I'm happy that he's the starting tight end of the Dallas Cowboys. He fills that need. On the D-line, we got two amazing pieces in Gerald McCoy as well as Dontari Poe, who are really going to shine in Dallas because that D-line has been something that's been needed to improve for a long time. And really the two biggest losses that the Cowboys had last offseason came down to Byron Jones and Robert Quinn. And with Byron Jones, there wasn't really anything we could do. He was asking for too much money. He wasn't that great, so we had to get rid of him. But on the D-line, Robert Quinn is a big hit. But we signed someone to take care of that, and it was a little bit risky, and that's Aldon Smith. Now, Aldon Smith has quite the criminal record. But if he ends up playing even a 1/10 of the percent of the way that he played last season, he'll be fantastic. The last season he played, Aldon Smith did great. So if he's able to hold that form from 2013, the Cowboys are going to be in great shape. They improved a lot this offseason. They signed a lot of important pieces, stealing HaHa Clinton-Dix for only a $4 million deal, fixing that safety position right up. The Dallas Cowboys have improved a lot. Coming in at number 4, we have the Baltimore Ravens. Now, the Ravens have had a pretty good offseason. People have been saying that it's one of the best, but I really think it's kind of here in the middle of the top tier. They signed pretty much every piece that they needed to keep. They didn't lose anyone, really, in free agency. And their big pickup that they had was defensive end Calais Campbell, who I think is going to work wonders for them. Sometimes in free agency, it's really not about adding a lot of pieces. It's really just about retaining what matters most. And that's exactly what the Ravens did. They added a big piece. They kept what really mattered. They franchise tagged Matthew Judon. And really, they don't have to worry about big contracts until next season. Once Lamar Jackson gets off that rookie deal, then they're going to have some issues because they're going to have to pay him a boatload of money. He'll probably be the highest paid quarterback in the NFL behind Patrick Mahomes, or maybe even higher than him, depending on how he plays next season. But the Ravens have really improved because they've kept everything the same. And that gives them a huge window of opportunity next year to really try to win the Super Bowl. Now, coming in at number 3, we have the New Orleans Saints. Now, I don't think a lot of people have been giving the New Orleans Saints enough credit for what they've really done in the offseason. Now, number 1, they re-signed quarterback Drew Brees, which people didn't think was going to happen. A lot of people were really worried that this was the end of his career and that he was going to retire. But more than that, they re-signed their backup option, Taysom Hill, and they also got a great safety who they originally had when they won their Super Bowl in Malcolm Jenkins, who will be a great presence on that defense. Someone who can really come in as a veteran and hold them together, and I'm glad that they took him from the Eagles. They got defensive lineman David Onyemata, who re-signed for another 3 years. They kept their guard, Andres Peat, which is good because, honestly, he was a really important piece on their offensive line. And best of all, they signed wide receiver Emmanuel Sanders. That is a terrifying offense. You have Drew Brees at quarterback, with Alvin Kamara at running back, Latavius Murray at backup running back. Then you have wide receiver Michael Thomas, number 1. And then you have wide receiver Emmanuel Sanders at number 2. The Saints are going to be terrifying. They still have Ted Ginn at number 3. They're going to be killer next season. I'll be surprised if they don't make it to the big game. But now let's get into number 2. And number 2 really hurts me. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, I'm not really the biggest fan of Tom Brady, just because I hate that one person who always wins over and over and over and over again. But the Buccaneers had a really good offseason because they had a great team last year. When you look at their roster and you look at the way that they played, they were really contenders for the Super Bowl. Except for one problem, and that was 30 interceptions from Jameis Winston. That's a lot of interceptions. When you're averaging 2 interceptions a game, there's not really very much chance you have of winning. But the funny thing is most of the Buccaneers' losses came by 3 points or less, which meant the Buccaneers weren't getting blown out. They were actually surviving with all of the turnovers that Jameis Winston had. So with the addition of Tom Brady, the Buccaneers have everything. They re-signed all their major pieces. They have a great offense. They have a great quarterback in charge. And really the sky is the limit for them. They're going to be contending with the Saints for the Super Bowl from the NFC. And we'll see how that ends up working out. But at number 1, we have the Indianapolis Colts. Wow. This, to me, was the greatest offseason I've seen in a long time coming out of the Colts. They re-signed the majority of their major pieces. They re-signed a huge piece of their offensive line in Anthony Costanzo. They got a new quarterback in Phillip Rivers, who is much better than Jacoby Brissett. They got DeForest Buckner from the 49ers. They got Xavier Rhodes to play cornerback. They improved everywhere. The Colts are going to be an amazing reckoning force next year in the AFC South. The only team they really have to beat is the Titans. They don't really have to worry about the Texans with DeAndre Hopkins being gone. They have everything necessary to win. They have the best offensive line in the league. They have one of the best defensive lines in the league with DeForest Buckner as well as Justin Houston backing that core up. They've got some great defensive backs, and now they have a great offense to go along with it. The Colts are going to be practically unstoppable next year if they can put it all together. But those are the best teams. What about the worst teams? What about the teams who really just stunk it up this offseason? Well, let's get into those right now. Coming in at number 5, we have the Minnesota Vikings. Now, going into last year, the Minnesota Vikings had a great team, and they were poised to be pretty good in the NFC North, a division that was pretty stacked with talent, but really they had a lot of pieces that were expected to do great things. But this offseason, they lost almost everything that made that team special. They lost their wide receiver 1 in Stephon Diggs via trade with the Buffalo Bills. They lost cornerback Trey Waynes. They lost Everson Griffin off the edge. They lost Mackenzie Alexander as their cornerback. They lost Linval Joseph, Jaron Kearse, Andrew Sendejo, and their cornerback Xavier Rhodes. The Minnesota Vikings just had too many losses. I mean, they got a couple of things. They got Eric Wilson, CJ Ham, and they franchise tagged Anthony Harris. Really, they didn't get any big pieces in free agency, and they lost a ton of their roster to other teams, meaning that the Vikings aren't going to be as great next season, and they're going to lose a lot of pieces that made them really special. Coming in at number 4, and this really makes me smile, it's the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, I don't know why people have been talking about the Eagles having this great offseason. Really, all they did was get one big piece, and that's cornerback Darius Slay. And I'll admit, he was great last season. But he was also kind of a liability to the Lions. He wasn't as fantastic as people really said he was last season. But that was the only thing they got. They got defensive lineman Javon Hargrave, who he'll be okay. Probably nothing great. I think they overpaid him by a lot. They signed him for 3 years, $39 million for $26 million guaranteed. Could end up being a liability to them. But they didn't really sign anything else. They re-signed Jalen Mills, a mediocre safety. They re-signed Rodney McLeod, their backup. They signed quarterback Nate Sudfeld as well as safety Will Parks. That's it. But let's look at what they lost. They lost Jason Peters, who was a premier tackle on their offensive line. They lost wide receiver Nelson Aguilar. They lost Ronald Darby at quarterback. They lost running back Jordan Howard. They lost Vinny Curry off the edge. And they lost their premier safety in Malcolm Jenkins. The Eagles got a good piece, but they lost about half their roster in return. And they're going to suffer big time for that. Coming in at number 3, we have the New England Patriots. Now, the New England Patriots is just a classic case of too many losses with not enough additions. The really only thing they did in the offseason was keep their guard Joe Thuney on franchise tag and re-sign Devin McCourty. That's it. They didn't sign any other big pieces in free agency. They didn't get any new receivers. They didn't get any new running backs. They pretty much got nothing. And here's what they lost. Their edge rusher in Kyle Van Noy, who's been playing fantastic. Their linebacker in Jamie Collins. Their D lineman Danny Shelton. Their center, Ted Karras, as well as Duran Harmon via trade. They lost a ton. Oh, and don't forget about their quarterback Tom Brady, who's been holding their team steady for years now. They didn't pick anyone up in replacement for him except for Brian Hoyer. And something tells me he's not going to be very great. As a backup for the Colts, who threw tons of interceptions in the place of Jacoby Brissett and was basically the defining player that kept them out of the playoffs last year. The New England Patriots are going to suffer next year, and something tells me they're tanking for a high pick in the next draft. This was an awful offseason for them, and they really didn't get any big improvements. Coming in at number 2, we have the Chicago Bears. Now, at face value, it looks like the Chicago Bears had a really good offseason. I mean, they made a trade for quarterback Nick Foles, and they got Robert Quinn from the Cowboys. And that's it. That's all they did. They wasted money in tons of other areas. They got backup safety Deion Bush, they got cornerback Artie Burns, they got safety Jordan Lucas, and they got tight end Jimmy Graham, who they signed for 2 years for some reason, even though he's been bouncing around team to team and hasn't really been all that good. And they signed him for $16 million on top of that, but also they lost like half of their roster. They lost their cornerback Prince Amukamara, they lost wide receiver Taylor Gabriel, they lost Nick Kwiatkowski, they lost their edge Leonard Floyd, they lost one of their linebackers in Kevin Pierre-Louis, they lost their backup quarterback Chase Daniel, they lost their guard Kyle Long, who retired, and of course they lost one of their best safeties in Clinton Dix. Chicago did nothing this offseason. They had the opportunity to really get some great pieces, and all they got was Robert Quinn. He was the only real addition to their team. Nick Foles is not going to carry the Chicago Bears because not only did they get him, but they also got his terrible contract from Jacksonville. That move was more of a detriment to the cap and more of a detriment to their roster than it ended up actually being helpful for their team. They should have got a cheaper quarterback on a deal they actually could have built around him because they have a terrible receiving core. They have no one on offense. They pretty much have no good pieces. They have no strong defensive players, and that defense that stood as one of the best in the league is really going to be put to the test this year. And if Khalil Mack and Robert Quinn can really put together something, then maybe the Bears have a chance. But they lost so many pieces in the offseason, I don't see that being very likely. And at number 1, we have the Los Angeles Rams. And oh my goodness, is this a sad story. We already talked about them earlier in the show, losing Brandin Cooks, but they lost so many other pieces. They lost backup wide receiver Mike Thomas, which isn't really that big of a deal. But then let's look at some more of their major losses. They lost their running back, Todd Gurley. They lost linebacker Clay Matthews. They lost other linebacker Dante Fowler. They lost their other linebacker Corey Littleton. They lost their cornerback in Nicole Roby-Coleman. And they even lost their kicker, Greg Zuerlein. The Rams lost everyone that mattered to that team. All of those pieces that really helped them get to the Super Bowl are gone. And now they're left with mediocre quarterback Jared Goff, 2 pretty good receivers, a terrible running back, a mediocre offensive line, no big players on defense besides Aaron Donald, and not even a kicker. The Rams are in trouble next season. They're pretty much going to drop off the face of the playoff picture and have no chance to make it to the Super Bowl. So that's it for today's show. We talked a lot about some trades that happened. We talked about the Texans, how they're falling apart, and we talked about some pretty terrible off seasons as well as some pretty great ones. Now, I'll be very interested to see how this NFL season actually shakes up with all this stuff going on with the coronavirus and the breaks happening. But those teams who had a great offseason, it doesn't even mean necessarily that they're going to have a great year. And for the teams who had a poor offseason, it doesn't even necessarily mean that they're going to have a bad year. All it means is that they're putting themselves either in a good position to win or a bad position to win. And we'll really see how all of those things shake out. So thank you all so much for watching today's episode. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you Tuesday with the next episode of the Left Bench Podcast. Because we may not be starters, but at least we can play Left Bench. See ya.